I knew something was off the instant I pulled into my driveway and spotted a strange SUV lounging in my garage like it owned the place. It wasn't my sister's, it wasn't my neighbor's, and it definitely wasn't mine. Worst of all, the garage door was hanging open as if the universe wanted me to witness its mockery in broad daylight. I'd been gone barely 8 hours, just enough time for a work meeting and a quick errand, and in that tiny window, someone had claimed my property like a lion marking new territory. My first thought was to laugh it off. Maybe some confused delivery driver had used my driveway for a turnaround, or an absent-minded Uber driver had typed in the wrong address. But the moment I stepped out of my own car and circled that SUV, my gut twisted. This was no casual mistake. The vehicle was aligned with almost military precision inside my garage, the doors locked tight. Even stranger, a half-empty Starbucks cup sat on the hood, condensation still forming droplets down its side. Fresh. Recent. Whose coffee was this? I swallowed hard, scanning my surroundings. My hands shook as I tested every window and door leading into my house. Front door, locked. Back patio, secure. Living room windows, untouched. Yet the garage was wide open, brazenly flaunting its unwelcome occupant. When I refocused on the Starbucks cup, a chill lanced through me. Whoever did this was still close. That realization felt like a jolt of ice water straight to my veins. Someone might even be inside, rummaging through my things or simply waiting for me. Determined to figure out who had decided to invade my space, I marched next door. That was my first official meeting with Karen. Before I even had a chance to knock on her door, she stepped out with a casual swagger, as if expecting me. Short bob haircut, big sunglasses perched on her nose, arms folded like she was about to lecture me. She radiated a kind of confidence that you only see in people who've never once been told no in their lives. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you happen to know whose SUV is parked in my garage?" She didn't hesitate for a second. "Yeah, it's mine." I stood there, blinking. I'd expected some baffled apology, or at the very least confusion. Instead, she took a leisurely sip of her drink. I caught a faint whiff of caramel macchiato. "I'm sorry. What?" "I parked there," she repeated, as though that ended the discussion. Her lip curled like I'd just demanded her firstborn. "Your steep driveway scraped my bumper last week, so think of this as your contribution to neighborhood parking reform." She eyed her fresh manicure, bored. The sheer audacity tasted metallic, like I'd bitten my tongue clean through. "You parked in my garage? Because you felt like it?" I managed at last, grappling for clarity. She shrugged. "It was empty, and you weren't home. What's the big deal?" My frustration flared. "The big deal is that it's my private property. You can't just barge in and occupy my garage like you own the place." She rolled her eyes as if I were being dense. "I was in a hurry. Your driveway's way too sloped for my SUV, and I didn't want to risk another scrape. Figured no harm done if you weren't using it." I exhaled, forcing calm into my voice. "This is trespassing, Karen. You need to move your car." She crossed her arms over her chest, not budging. "I will, but I've got errands first. I'll get it later." My patience snapped. "Later?" The disbelief made me laugh out loud. "No, you'll move it now." Karen let out a melodramatic sigh like some heroine in a soap opera. "I can't. I'm about to meet friends for lunch, and I'm already running late. Be a good neighbor and let it be." Then, without waiting for a response, she vanished back inside her house. The door closed with a crisp click, leaving me standing there, anger burning in my gut. I'd seen arrogant behavior before, but she took it to a level bordering on performance art. Part of me wanted to call the police and have her towed on principle, but another side of me, one I didn't know I had, craved a pettier, more personal vengeance. Fine, I thought. If you love using my garage so much, let's see how you like being stuck there. I stormed back to my house, snatched the garage remote off the kitchen counter, and locked everything down. I secured the side door with a sturdy deadbolt, tested it twice, then did the same with the main overhead door using the manual lock. Satisfied, I grabbed my suitcase, already packed for a short getaway I'd been planning, and left. If Karen wanted to park in my garage, she could enjoy it as long as she pleased. What I didn't realize was that Karen had evidently sauntered back into my garage at some point, probably to retrieve her Starbucks or something from the SUV. She might have assumed she had free reign. By the time she noticed I'd locked up and left with the remote, it was too late. Meanwhile, I was already on the highway, windows down, feeling a surge of triumph. I convinced myself I'd given her a taste of her own entitlement. I had no clue I'd inadvertently turned my garage into a makeshift prison for the duration of my week-long vacation. While I was halfway to a tranquil beach rental, Karen was discovering the unique horrors of being trapped. She had her purse and her car, but not much else. The phone signal in my enclosed garage was practically non-existent. No landline, no working restroom. The stash of stale protein bars on a dusty shelf, leftovers from my ill-advised attempt at dieting, was the only real food source. Desperate, she banged on the walls, shouted for help, and even attempted to pick the side door lock with a bobby pin. My dog door on that side was definitely not built for a grown woman, but apparently she tried that too. She got stuck halfway before managing to wriggle herself back inside, presumably cursing me every inch of the way. Her husband, Greg, back at their house, was initially unperturbed. He assumed she'd embarked on one of her shopping marathons or maybe a day at the spa. Susan, Karen's best friend and frequent gossip partner, started to worry by day 2, but Greg shrugged her off. He figured if Karen wanted attention, she'd call or text. That was her specialty. Meanwhile, the hours in my garage must have stretched like weeks for her. The air must have smelled of rubber tires and stale coffee, the walls pressing in with claustrophobic glee. By the time I kicked back on a lounge chair, sipping a cocktail and enjoying the ocean breeze, Karen was in full meltdown mode. She hammered the SUV's horn until the battery died. She rummaged through her glove box and center console, unearthing a half-melted chocolate bar, a small pack of stale crackers, and an ancient energy drink. Hardly gourmet, but it kept her from starving. The bigger issue was the absence of a toilet. Humiliating though it was, she resorted to an empty Starbucks cup, praying no one would ever learn of this moment. She probably cursed my name 1,000 times, vowing revenge, lawsuits, or worse. Eventually, the adrenaline rush that had fueled her indignation seeped away, leaving only exhaustion. She tried texting me. Once she realized she had a faint signal if she held her phone at a specific angle near the garage window. The texts I eventually received were furious, panicked, and occasionally borderline incoherent. "Help me, you monster. Let me out. I've been stuck for days. You will pay for this." I didn't see those messages right away. My phone was in airplane mode because I wanted a real break from daily life. When I finally turned it on midway through my trip, I was greeted by an onslaught of Karen's please-turn threats. My first reaction was shock, followed swiftly by amusement. She had told me to be a good neighbor and let her park there after all. Well, now she was dealing with the consequences of her own arrogance. I considered cutting my trip short. But then I imagined Karen's manicured nails tapping in fury, her outraged expression, when she realized I wasn't sprinting home to rescue her. My pettiness flared. Instead of canceling my vacation, I simply screenshot her messages for posterity and ordered another cocktail. Might as well enjoy the sunshine, I thought. Let Karen stew in her self-inflicted mess a bit longer. Let's be perfectly clear. I didn't know she was rationing stale protein bars or waging war against an impenetrable dog door. Nor did I know about her humiliating Starbucks cup bathroom system. But the moment those texts came in, I definitely felt a certain satisfaction. I ordered a flight of margaritas and dubbed the first one Karmarita, raising it in a silent toast to poetic justice. Meanwhile, Karen's psychological battle raged on. Daylight hours were excruciating. Her attempts to honk for help had killed the car battery early on, so no more noise. She shouted at the walls, pounded on them, and occasionally heard footsteps passing outside. The neighbors either didn't hear or simply chose not to investigate strange thumps coming from my property. They sure weren't about to risk tangling with Karen's drama. At night, the darkness of the garage must have felt like a tomb. Every creak or rustle, every distant bark set her nerves aflame. She started talking to inanimate objects, mostly that Starbucks cup, the original half-empty one that had lulled her into thinking she owned my space. She named it something like Wilson, drawing from that old Castaway movie reference as though a piece of plastic and cardboard could keep her company in this ordeal. Maybe she ranted to it about me, about Greg, about the universe's injustice. At some point, she must have realized that Greg wasn't coming. If she expected him to burst in heroically, she was sorely mistaken. On day 3 or 4, Time probably blurred for her. I finally decided I'd had enough sun and sand. The novelty of ignoring her texts wore off, and curiosity gnawed at me. I wanted to see her face when I reopened that garage. Part of me still didn't fully believe she'd been trapped the entire time, yet her texts hinted that was exactly the case. So I headed home, half curious, half apprehensive. Pulling into my driveway, I clicked the remote. The garage door groaned in protest. As soon as it rose a few feet, Karen burst out in a whirlwind of rage and ragged hair, practically falling over herself to escape. She looked disheveled in a way I'd never seen. Her once perfect bob was frizzy and unkempt, her makeup smeared or entirely gone, and her clothes streaked with sweat and dust. The air that rushed out with her smelled like stale desperation and utter fury. "You psychopath!" she screeched, her voice hoarse. "You locked me in there for days. I could have died." I raised an eyebrow, sipping my iced coffee with an infuriating calm. "Thought you'd move your SUV when I asked. Guess you never got around to it." She looked ready to pounce on me, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles went white. "I'm calling the cops," she shrilled. "This is unlawful imprisonment, kidnapping. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Go ahead," I said mildly, reaching into my pocket for my phone. "You can use mine if yours is dead. But, you might want to see something first." Karen blinked, momentarily derailed. "See what?" I walked to my trunk, lifted it, and pulled out a small security camera I'd detached from the side of my house. "I've got cameras all around my property," I explained, powering up the device and tapping the screen. "They've been rolling since before you decided to claim my garage as your own. Take a look." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she snatched the camera, scanning the footage. There she was, telling me to lighten up and let her keep her SUV in my garage. There she was again, sneaking back in, rummaging through the vehicle. Then me, leaving with my bag, no clue she was inside. The camera's angle showed her crossing the threshold into my garage, presumably to grab her coffee, right before I locked it. "I had no idea you were in there," I told her calmly, arms folded. "From my perspective, you were trespassing. Legally, you locked yourself in," she sputtered, color rising in her cheeks. "You can't prove I was stuck in there the whole time." My smirk grew. "Aside from the frantic texts you sent me, because I saved those, they paint a pretty clear timeline." I flipped open my phone's messaging app, holding it so she could see. Her messages glowed on the screen. "I've been here for days. Let me out, you psycho. You'll regret this." They were dated and time-stamped, which left no room for ambiguity. Karen's furious bravado wavered. She looked like she wanted to rip the phone out of my hand or stomp on it. Just then, headlights swept across the driveway as her husband, Greg, pulled in. He hopped out, blinking at the scene. Karen in disarray, me standing there with coffee and phone in hand. "Babe?" he asked. "Where have you been? Susan called me like 4 times, saying she hadn't seen you. You okay?" Karen wheeled on him. "Am I okay? This lunatic locked me in his garage for days." Greg blinked at her, then at me. "Why, were you in his garage?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "That's not the point. He locked it with me inside." I cleared my throat. "Actually, I locked it not knowing you were still there. You parked without permission and refused to move your car. Then you just stayed." Greg rubbed the back of his neck. "So you parked in his garage, and then you got stuck?" Karen let out a strangled noise. "Greg, he left me there. I had no food, no bathroom. Had some protein bars, though," I said. "And I see you found that Starbucks cup. Or cups, maybe?" Karen's eyes narrowed, fury and shame swirling behind them. She turned to Greg, desperate for sympathy, but he just pinched the bridge of his nose. "Karen," he said softly, "I can't believe you did that." I watched her face contort. She'd probably spent all those days imagining how vindicated she'd feel once freed, certain everyone would side with her. Instead, she was getting scolded by her own husband. Deciding to end the spectacle, I turned to Karen. "Look, I'm not pressing charges. Let's just call it a lesson learned. But I will be upgrading my security, and if I ever catch you on my property again without permission, we'll have a real problem." She turned on me with a scowl so fierce I thought she might bare her teeth. You think this is over? You have no idea who you're messing with. I shrugged, choosing not to engage further. Suit yourself. Just then, her phone chimed. She glanced down and her expression darkened. Greg peeked at the screen. Is that from the HOA? Karen's voice was tight. They're fining me, and they're revoking my privileges for a year. Pool, clubhouse, everything. My name's on some community disturbance list. I tried and failed to hide a grin. Guess you made an impression on more than just me. She nearly snapped her phone in half. Greg cleared his throat. Come on, let's just go home. He ushered her toward their car, but she paused at the passenger door, glancing back at me. Her face flickered with something besides anger, fear, embarrassment, maybe both. For an instant, her voice cracked. The spiders, she whispered, almost as though she couldn't believe what she was confessing. There were spiders in there. Then, with a sharp inhale, she yanked the door open, climbed inside, and slammed it shut. Greg looked at me apologetically, mumbled something under his breath, and got in the driver's seat. They backed out of my driveway, Karen glaring at me as if she could sear holes through the windshield with her rage. Once they were gone, the tension I hadn't realized I was holding in my shoulders slowly eased. I stood there for a moment, gazing at the now empty garage. It was surreal to think of Karen cooped up in there, reduced to rationing stale crackers and using old Starbucks cups for a toilet. The irony that her brand new Starbucks drink had lured her inside in the first place wasn't lost on me. She'd wanted to assert dominance or some misguided sense of parking reform, and she ended up trapped by her own entitlement. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with talk. A few folks from down the street gave me sympathetic nods or stifled laughs, having heard rumors about Karen's meltdown. Susan stopped by to verify if it was true that Karen had spent nearly a week locked in my garage. I neither confirmed nor denied the specifics, just mentioned it was a misunderstanding that got way out of hand. Truth be told, I never intended to hold Karen hostage. I was angry, sure, and I wanted to teach her a lesson, but I assumed she'd just move her SUV and leave. Instead, she doubled down on her arrogance. Life has a funny way of delivering payback sometimes. That fiasco was a potent reminder that boundaries matter, even if you have to reinforce them with a deadbolt. A few weeks later, I installed an upgraded security system. Cameras, motion detectors, the works. The idea of Karen, or anyone else, deciding my garage was fair game no longer felt outlandish. I wasn't looking to start another neighborhood war, but I also wasn't going to let my property be an open invitation. As for Karen, I saw her occasionally, usually from across the street. She'd pointedly avert her gaze whenever I waved. Rumor had it she was furious about her HOA penalties, though it seemed she was keeping a lower profile for the moment. Maybe she feared I'd share the security footage or forward her text messages to the entire neighborhood. Maybe she was just biding her time, plotting some grand revenge. But after spending days in a locked garage, living on questionable snacks, maybe she'd learned enough to realize that antagonizing me again wasn't worth the risk. Sometimes I wondered if she lay awake at night, still hearing the echo of her own frantic pounding against those locked doors, the scuttling of spiders in the shadows, the frustration of a phone that wouldn't hold a signal. Perhaps next time she'd see an empty garage, she'd remember the stale smell of desperation and think twice. For my part, I learned that crossing the line into petty revenge can spiral into something far beyond what you intend. I never thought I'd inadvertently hold someone captive. But then again, I never thought someone would be brazen enough to park in my garage without so much as a "by your leave." Life teaches lessons in unexpected ways. And if you ask me whether I regret the incident, I'd say, not really. It's not often that karma is served up so neatly. In the end, Karen did this to herself. She'd marched into my garage so certain she was untouchable. She never considered the possibility that her own entitlement might lock her in place, literally. While she might blame me until the end of time, that's on her. As for me, the next time I find a strange car in my garage, I'll probably handle it differently. Maybe. Or maybe I'll remember the triumphant taste of that karma-rita, grin to myself, and let the universe sort things out all over again.